The Secret Garden of the Amazon, America's desperate, untold war for rubber. The hook. Imagine a war fought not with bullets, but with beetles. Not on beaches, but deep in the fever-ridden jungles of the Amazon. And not for land, but for a single, essential commodity that decided the fate of every tank, plane, and truck in the Allied arsenal. This is the story of how the United States, facing total military collapse, launched a covert, multi-billion-dollar, decade-long ecological crusade to steal the secrets of a plant and save the modern world. It is a tale of scientific espionage, unimaginable wealth squandered, indigenous genocide, and a secret government operation so vast and ambitious it rivals the Manhattan Project, a project to secure natural rubber, the black gold that fueled the American century, and which, in 1942, was on the verge of vanishing forever. Chapter 1. The Black Gold Crisis. In the winter of 1941, as the United States was dragged into the abyss of World War II, America's true Achilles heel was revealed not by German U-boats, but by Japanese infantry. The industrial world, built on the internal combustion engine, ran on rubber. Tanks needed rubber treads. Aircraft needed rubber hoses and tires for landing. Submarines needed rubber seals. Every single truck, the workhorse of the U.S. military, required at least a half-ton of rubber per year. Without it, the vast military machine would grind to a halt. And then, in a devastating 6-month campaign beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan seized control of over 90% of the world's natural rubber supply. This staggering monopoly was centered in Malaya, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia. The rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis, originally native to the Amazon, had been secretly transplanted and industrialized there in the late 19th century by the British, creating a monoculture empire that fed the burgeoning factories of Detroit and Akron. When Singapore fell in February 1942, the U.S. realized its strategic reserves, less than a 1-year supply, would soon be gone. The implications were catastrophic. Secretary of War Henry Stimson famously declared, "The war will be lost unless we get rubber." President Franklin D. Roosevelt, understanding the existential threat, created the Rubber Reserve Company, RRC, and gave it a mission of absolute urgency. Find rubber, or the war stops. The ghosts of Fordlandia, a century of failure. America's desperation was compounded by a shameful history of failure. The U.S. had tried for decades to establish its own rubber supply on home turf or in its territories, only to be thwarted by nature itself. The greatest American failure lay in the Amazon, the very birthplace of the Hevea tree. In 1928, industrial titan Henry Ford, in a fit of paternalistic idealism, purchased over 2 million acres of Brazilian jungle and created Fordlandia and Belterra. His goal was to mass-produce rubber under American industrial management. Ford failed disastrously. He transplanted Western-style workers' housing, golf courses, and Prohibition-era rules into the impenetrable jungle. Crucially, he made the same ecological mistake the British had avoided. He planted his Hevea trees in dense, organized rows. In its native state, the Hevea tree is naturally scattered across the vast jungle, keeping a safe distance from its greatest predator, the South American leaf blight, Microcyclus ule. When Ford planted thousands of trees together, the fungus rapidly evolved into a lethal, airborne plague, wiping out his entire plantation investment and leaving behind the haunting ruins of his industrial utopia. The lesson was clear. Natural rubber could not be farmed in the Amazon using modern methods. Any large-scale U.S. attempt to secure rubber would not only face the Japanese Navy, but also the insurmountable biological defenses of the rainforest itself. Operation Amazon, the scramble for the wild tree. With the Malayan plantation sealed off, the RRC looked to the only remaining source, the wild, scattered trees of the Amazon basin, the original, untamed supply. This initiative, known unofficially as Operation Amazon, or often referred to simply as the rubber escalation, was a logistical nightmare and a humanitarian disaster in the making. The goal was to mobilize an army of rubber tappers, known as seringueiros, into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. The pact with Brazil. In a high-stakes deal, the U.S. provided Brazil with immense financial aid, military equipment, and crucially, an unprecedented $100 million in direct cash advances. In return, Brazilian President Getulio Vargas agreed to recruit and deploy 50,000 new seringueiros. They were cynically nicknamed rubber soldiers. The recruitment drive was a form of economic conscription. Young, impoverished men from the drought-stricken northeast of Brazil were promised fortune and patriotism. They were shipped thousands of miles upriver into the deep jungle, equipped with meager supplies, and often promised tools and medicine that never materialized. The reality of the jungle. The environment was brutal. The seringueiros faced disease, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and other tropical diseases decimated the recruits. An estimated 30,000 rubber soldiers died during the operation. More casualties than the U.S. suffered in many of its initial Pacific Island campaigns. Logistics. The RRC had to buy, store, and transport the rubber. They built enormous warehouse facilities, airfields, and communications networks in the middle of the jungle. They paid inflated prices for every pound of latex, fighting corruption, bureaucracy, and the river currents. Inefficiency. The wild trees produced only a fraction of the yield of the carefully cultivated Asian plantations. The costs were astronomical, and the output was pitifully small, only enough for a few months' reserve supply. Operation Amazon, despite the immense human cost and financial outlay, totaling nearly $350 million in 1940s dollars, was a strategic failure. The U.S. needed a more radical solution. The scientific espionage, the seeds of survival. The failure of Operation Amazon pushed the RRC and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, toward their most audacious and most secret initiative, the quest for the blight-resistant hybrid. The challenge was elegant in its complexity. Create a rubber tree that produced the high yield of the Asian plantations but was immune to the devastating Amazonian blight, a tree that could be grown anywhere. The scientific team, based secretly in the USDA's tropical research labs in Honduras, Costa Rica, and Haiti, realized the solution lay in a genetic splicing. The crown, resistance they needed to graft the blight-resistant crown, the top branches and leaves, from a hardy, wild Amazonian tree. These trees were low yield but could survive the blight. The trunk, yield they needed to graft this crown onto the high-yielding trunk and rootstock of the genetically pure, but blight-susceptible Asian-type trees. This required a vast, secret operation to procure, smuggle, and cultivate the genetic material. The Great Seed Smuggling. The U.S. government covertly launched missions into the most remote parts of the Brazilian jungle to collect and catalog blight-resistant strains. This was scientific espionage disguised as botanical exploration. The most valuable material came from the remaining, successful Asian plantations before they were completely overrun. A few dedicated U.S., Dutch, and British agents risked their lives to physically smuggle blight-resistant rubber seeds and budwood out of Southeast Asia under the noses of the Japanese Imperial Army. These seeds were often flown across continents in hermetically sealed containers, rushed to the tropical USDA labs, and immediately crossbred. The scientists, working under intense pressure and absolute secrecy, perfected the grafting technique. They created a hybrid tree with the high productivity of the Asian strain and the ecological armor of the Amazonian wild tree. The Parallel Project. Synthetic rubber. While the jungle war was being fought, the RRC simultaneously launched the largest, most expensive crash industrial program in U.S. history, the development of synthetic rubber, WWII. In 1942, the U.S. allocated over $700 million, over $12 billion in modern currency, to build 51 gigantic synthetic rubber plants across the Midwest. This was a partnership between the government and major chemical companies like Goodyear, Goodrich, and Standard Oil. The technological challenge was immense, scaling up a laboratory curiosity into an industrial necessity in less than 2 years. The scientific breakthroughs were staggering, often involving government seizure of patented processes to ensure speed. By 1943, the synthetic plants began producing. By 1944, the U.S. was producing over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, more than the entire world's pre-war natural supply. It was this industrial triumph, this massive mobilization of chemistry, that ultimately saved the war effort. The American public was asked to sacrifice, tires were rationed and recapped, until the synthetic supply could come online. The legacy, a victory won and a debt unpaid. By the end of the war, the U.S. had secured its rubber supply through a two-pronged, multi-billion-dollar effort: the industrial miracle of synthetic rubber and the covert ecological war for the blight-resistant hybrid. The astonishing truth is that the synthetic program was so successful that it fundamentally and permanently broke the back of the natural rubber monopoly. The U.S. never again relied on foreign plantations for its strategic needs. The unpaid debt. However, the human cost of the Amazonian operation was devastating. When the war ended, the U.S. government, now with an abundant synthetic supply, abruptly ended its contracts and withdrew its support from the Amazon. The 30,000 rubber soldiers who had survived the jungle were stranded, abandoned by the Brazilian government and forgotten by the U.S. Many had debt, no means of return, and had contributed to significant environmental damage in the Amazon. The vast infrastructure built by the RRC, the airfields, warehouses, and communications, was left to decay, swallowed quickly by the jungle. The forgotten war for rubber stands as one of the most astonishing, high-stakes, and environmentally destructive secret operations in U.S. history, a stark illustration of the lengths America would go to secure the materials required to fight a total war. The victory was won in the chemical labs of Ohio and the covert botanical gardens of Central America, but the debt was paid with the lives of the seringueiros deep within the Amazon jungle. Chapter 2: The Green Heist, Smuggling the Seeds of Salvation. The Race Against Time. Genetic Lockdown. The year is 1942. With the Malay Peninsula and the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, firmly under Japanese control, the vast, orderly plantations, the source of 90% of global rubber, were converted into a strategic asset for the Empire of Japan. To the Japanese High Command, rubber was not just wealth, it was leverage. They knew the American war machine was starving. For the U.S., the failure of the Amazonian Wild Rubber Initiative meant that the genetic purity of the Asian rubber stock was now priceless. These Asian trees, descendants of a few thousand seeds smuggled out of Brazil nearly 70 years prior, were high-yielding but terribly susceptible to the Amazonian leaf blight. If the Japanese managed to introduce the blight to Asia, either accidentally or as an act of biological warfare, they would destroy the future global supply, even if the U.S. eventually won the war. The USDA scientists, led by the beleaguered but brilliant botanist Dr. E.V. Fawcett, understood they had a small, rapidly closing window of opportunity. They needed to execute two simultaneous botanical maneuvers: steal the good genes, retrieve samples of the high-yielding Asian seeds and budwood before they were completely locked down or destroyed. Find the immunity. Continue the desperate search in the Amazon for the specific, ultra-rare strains of wild hevea that possessed absolute, heritable resistance to the blight, Microcyclus ule. Operation Red Bud, the Singapore and Ceylon Gambit. The most spectacular effort focused on acquiring the high-yielding budwood. This wood, used for grafting, contained the pure genetic lines that the Allied world was built on. The missions were not military. They were small-scale, highly covert civilian and intelligence operations relying on deep local knowledge. The Ceylon connection. The most critical initial success came not from the war zone, but from the comparatively safer British colony of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. While geographically distant from the immediate Japanese invasion, Ceylon housed some of the oldest, most carefully maintained British rubber research stations, possessing invaluable high-yield cultivars. The U.S., working with the British Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, arranged a secret transfer. U.S. agents, posing as agricultural inspectors, were dispatched to Ceylon to collect thousands of carefully prepared budwood sticks, thin pieces of rubber tree branch, each containing a single genetic copy of a high-yield strain. The challenge was time and temperature. Budwood is highly perishable and must be kept cool and moist. The sticks, wrapped in wax and moist moss, were secretly loaded onto the fastest available British destroyers or long-range U.S. bombers flying circuitous routes over the Indian Ocean to reach the nearest safe Allied territory in Africa or the Middle East. From there, they were immediately rushed to the USDA's tropical research centers in Central America. This daring aerial botanical relay was the first successful phase of the genetic transfer. The Java Rescue. The stakes were far higher in the Dutch East Indies, specifically the island of Java. Here, Dutch planters and researchers held the cutting edge of hevea breeding science. As the Japanese advanced in early 1942, a small group of Dutch planters, realizing the military significance of their work, mounted a heroic, unscripted evacuation. They didn't save their clothes or their cash. They focused on their botanical treasures. Working under fire, they collected thousands of genetically tagged seeds and budwood samples. The escape involved perilous journeys on overloaded civilian boats and rudimentary fishing trawlers, sailing through Japanese-patrolled waters to Australia. Many of the boats were sunk, and many of the planters and their cargo were lost. However, the successful arrivals delivered their biological cargo directly into the hands of waiting U.S. and Australian intelligence officers. This material provided the necessary genetic diversity to prevent a complete bottleneck in the U.S. breeding program. The Amazonian deep dive, hunting for immunity. While the high-yield genes were being salvaged from Asia, the USDA had a simultaneous, more dangerous mission back in the Amazon, finding the rare, immune mother trees. Dr. Fawcett and his dedicated USDA field scientists knew that somewhere in the vast, biodiverse jungle, there existed a handful of Hevea brasiliensis trees that had survived every natural outbreak of the leaf blight over centuries. These trees, while often low-yielding, contained the pure, untapped secret to immunity: the strategy of scatter. Unlike the failed industrial methods of Fordlandia, the USDA's new strategy was based on observation of nature. Isolation. The teams focused on extremely remote, high-altitude tributaries where the trees were naturally scattered by miles of dense rainforest, a biological firebreak against the blight's airborne spores. Identification. Indigenous guides and highly experienced seringueiros were essential. They knew the trees that looked healthier or different after major fungal attacks. Extraction. Once an immune mother tree was identified, the team would rapidly collect seeds and, more importantly, scions, small cuttings for grafting. This material then had to be transported hundreds of miles by canoe, mule, and finally by U.S. military transport planes back to the research center in Turrialba, Costa Rica. This work was excruciatingly slow, plagued by disease, hostile climate, and occasionally, armed opposition from groups that viewed the U.S. as infringing on their sovereign territory. The scientists faced the same hardships as the rubber soldiers, but their mission was more fragile: keeping a small, delicate biological specimen alive during a multi-week transit. The Turrialba greenhouse, where worlds met. The ultimate destination for nearly all smuggled and collected genetic material was the USDA's Tropical Agricultural Station at Turrialba, Costa Rica. This facility became the secret, beating heart of the U.S. war effort for rubber. Here, under immense pressure, the complex process of double grafting was perfected. Stage 1. The rootstock, high-yielding Asian seeds, smuggled from Ceylon/Java, were grown into seedlings. Stage 2. The blight-resistant crown, the blight-resistant budwood, smuggled from the Amazon, was carefully grafted onto the seedlings. The result, a new, revolutionary hevea hybrid, a tree with the high productivity roots and trunk of the Asian stock, but the immune crown of the Amazonian wild tree. The stakes were astronomical. If one blight-resistant crown proved incompatible, or if a single fungal spore contaminated the Turrialba greenhouse, the entire 2-year effort, the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent, and the future of the global rubber industry were at risk. The scientists at Turrialba were not just saving the U.S. war effort, they were quietly engineering a biological weapon against the forces of nature, ensuring that the blight could never again trap the world's industry in a single geographic region. This small, unheralded station, constantly guarded by U.S. military personnel, was one of the most strategically important laboratories of World War II. The immediate impact and the future threat. By 1944, the Turrialba station was successfully propagating thousands of these new, blight-resistant clones. While they were too late to significantly aid the immediate war effort, which was saved by synthetic rubber, they represented an incredible strategic victory. The U.S. had broken the natural monopoly forever. After the war, these clones would be distributed globally, fundamentally changing the agricultural map of rubber, enabling new, massive plantations in Africa and elsewhere, safe from the Amazonian blight. This secret campaign of smuggling and scientific ingenuity ensured that even if Japan had held on to its Asian territories for another decade, the U.S. had already secured the genetic key to its own industrial destiny. It was a victory not of brute force, but of patience, covert action, and a profound respect for the complex, unforgiving laws of botany. Chapter 3. The Billion-Dollar Alchemy. America builds a chemical fortress. The unthinkable gap. Crisis on the home front. By the beginning of 1942, the reality of the rubber deficit had hit the American public with the force of a bomb. Every automobile tire, every rubber boot, every piece of hospital tubing became a precious, rationed commodity. President Roosevelt called for a national effort, stating that the rubber crisis was the most vital problem confronting the nation, next to the actual fighting of the war. The war machine needed millions of tons of rubber, but the domestic reserve was dropping daily. The strategic decision was clear. The only way to close the gap was not through biology, the slow growth of hevea trees, but through chemistry. The United States had to become its own primary source of rubber, and it had to do so virtually overnight. The grand design, the Rubber Reserve Company's mandate. The responsibility for this unprecedented mobilization fell upon the Rubber Reserve Company, RRC, now backed by an initial authorization of $700 million, later swelling to over $1 billion. Their mandate was simple: build a new, fully integrated industry from scratch in less than 2 years. The synthetic rubber America needed was BUNA-S, styrene butadiene rubber, a polymer first developed in Germany. The process was chemically complex and highly industrialized, requiring 3 core components. Butadiene, a petroleum byproduct, derived from crude oil or ethanol. Styrene, a petrochemical derived from coal tar or petroleum. Polymerization plants. Massive, specialized factories to chemically combine butadiene and styrene into the solid BUNA-S crumb. The challenge was not the formula. The challenge was scaling the production from laboratory flasks to industrial pipelines capable of producing hundreds of thousands of tons. The cartel wars and the scientific compromise. Before a single plant could be built, the RRC had to navigate a minefield of corporate rivalry and patent law. Pre-war research on synthetic rubber was dominated by a handful of giants. Standard Oil held key patents on the butadiene process, often acquired through complex deals with the German chemical giant, IG Farben. Goodyear and Goodrich, held key polymerization and processing techniques. These companies were fierce competitors, each unwilling to share its proprietary secrets. The RRC's solution was an unprecedented act of government intervention, forced cooperation. Under the emergency powers of the war, the U.S. government compelled these companies to pool their patents, personnel, and knowledge into a collaborative effort known as the Synthetic Rubber Research Group. The federal government effectively took control of the patents, licensed them freely to any company willing to build the plants, and standardized the production process. This move shattered decades of corporate secrecy overnight, unleashing a wave of collective scientific innovation. The butadiene boom, building the chemical pipeline. The butadiene requirement was the biggest logistical hurdle. It was a gaseous chemical, volatile and dangerous, requiring massive refinery capacity. The RRC commissioned the construction of huge new processing facilities in the Gulf Coast states, the Midwest, and California, placing them strategically near existing oil refineries. The engineering feat was staggering. Miles of specialized piping, enormous distillation columns, and complex cooling systems were erected in locations that, just months before, were empty fields. The sheer scale of construction was unmatched. The government offered incredible incentives and prioritized the necessary steel, copper, and labor. Crucially, the government standardized the recipe. Instead of allowing each company to build its own distinct type of plant, the RRC dictated the exact specifications. This allowed different companies to specialize in different parts of the process, ensuring that the butadiene produced by a standard oil plant could immediately be used by a Goodyear polymerization plant hundreds of miles away. This interchangeability was the key to the program's rapid success. The transformation of the Midwest, Akron's new destiny. The epicenter of the polymerization process, where the butadiene and styrene were finally combined, was often located near the historical rubber heartland in the Midwest, especially Akron, Ohio. These polymerization plants were unlike anything seen before. They operated continuously, running 24 hours a day, manned by thousands of newly recruited workers, many of them women joining the workforce for the first time. The process involved emulsification. Butadiene and styrene were mixed with soap and water to form an emulsion. Polymerization. This mixture was cooked in giant, pressurized reactors, often resembling massive, sealed brewery vats. This is where the simple molecules linked up to form the long, elastic chains of the polymer. Coagulation. The resulting latex was then chemically treated, causing the rubber to coagulate into solid crumbs. Drying and baling. Finally, the crumb was dried in ovens and pressed into 75-pound bales, ready to be shipped to tire manufacturers. From raw petroleum to usable rubber bale, the entire process was now happening within the American mainland, protected from Japanese forces and the Amazonian blight. The victory of volume, the turning point. The synthetic rubber program began to pay dividends in late 1943. While the first bales were often inconsistent, sometimes sticky, sometimes brittle, engineers rapidly improved the formula and the process. In 1942, U.S. production of synthetic rubber was negligible. By the end of 1944, U.S. plants were producing over 820,000 long tons of synthetic rubber. This volume was not only sufficient to meet the entire military demand, but was more than the total pre-war production of all Asian rubber plantations combined. It was an astonishing achievement that required over $1 billion in federal investment. The construction of 51 major integrated plants. The mobilization of tens of thousands of skilled workers and chemists. The sheer scale of the output fundamentally changed the trajectory of the war. American generals no longer had to worry about running out of tire rubber. The strategic weakness had been transformed into an industrial fortress. The combination of the synthetic solution and the botanical insurance the blight-resistant hybrids, meant that when the war ended, America was not only victorious but was now industrially and chemically independent from the world's natural rubber supply, ushering in a new era of petrochemical dominance. Chapter 4: The Unpaid Debt, Abandonment and the Amazonian Scars. The Great Betrayal, when the taps went dry. By mid-1945, the victory of synthetic rubber was complete. The massive factories of the American Midwest were churning out over 1 million tons of BWII annually, ensuring a permanent and reliable supply for the post-war economy. The immediate, desperate need for the dwindling, difficult, and expensive wild rubber of the Amazon had vanished. The official end of the war in August 1945 signaled a sudden, brutal halt to Operation Amazon. The U.S. government, through the Rubber Reserve Company, RRC, executed a swift and decisive withdrawal. Contracts were terminated, massive loans and advances to Brazilian firms were recalled, and all logistical support was immediately cut off. The U.S. had secured what it needed and was gone. This swift departure left the Brazilian government, and more acutely, the tens of thousands of recruited rubber soldiers, seringueiros, in an immediate, catastrophic crisis. The fate of the rubber soldiers. Recruited from the arid northeast of Brazil with promises of wealth, land, and patriotic glory, the 50,000 seringueiros had been shipped to the deep jungle. They survived years of malaria, dysentery, hostile isolation, and unimaginable physical hardship. They successfully harvested hundreds of tons of latex, often dying for a few pounds of the precious material. When the war ended, they were left with nothing. Isolation and debt. Many were hundreds of miles up remote tributaries, lacking the means to return home. The promise of free passage back to the Northeast was never fulfilled. Worse, many were bound by debt bondage, aviamento system, to the local rubber barons who had supplied them with food and tools on credit. With the RRC gone, the prices for wild rubber plummeted, trapping the seringueiros in perpetual servitude. Disease and death. The war had forced them into areas with high rates of malaria and yellow fever. Without the medical supplies and infrastructure provided by the fleeting U.S. military presence, these diseases surged again. The official death toll was around 30,000 during the operation, but the post-war abandonment likely led to thousands more fatalities from disease and starvation. A lost generation. Brazil's rubber soldiers were not treated as heroes. They were forgotten economic tools. Their contribution, a desperate, high-cost supply that bridged the gap until synthetic rubber arrived, was wiped from the national memory. The entire operation, initiated to save the American military machine, concluded with one of the most cynical betrayals of labor in the history of the Americas, leaving behind an impoverished, marooned population. The scars on the jungle, environmental and social fallout. The rapid, unregulated nature of the wartime rubber drive inflicted lasting damage on the Amazonian ecosystem and local indigenous populations. 1. Ecological damage. The emergency drive was focused on maximum yield, not sustainability. Unlike the careful rotational tapping of traditional seringueiros, the wartime rush led to overtapping, slicing too deeply into the bark of the wild hevea trees to extract the maximum amount of latex. This practice severely weakened or killed countless wild trees, damaging the long-term viability of the natural stock. Furthermore, the vast logistics network built by the RRC, hundreds of miles of new trails, clearings for camps, and makeshift airfields, disrupted sensitive ecological areas. When abandoned, these clearings were quickly overgrown but left fragmented habitats vulnerable to invasion. 2. Indigenous disruption. The influx of 50,000 new workers into previously remote areas led to violent conflicts and the introduction of European diseases to isolated indigenous communities who had no natural immunity. The Brazilian government, eager to clear land for rubber tapping, often ignored or actively violated the traditional territories of the Amazon's native people. The pursuit of the black gold brought severe cultural disruption, displacement, and in some areas, outright violence, furthering a cycle of exploitation that has long plagued the region. The U.S. geopolitical legacy, a shift in power. While the U.S. withdrew quickly, the economic impact of the synthetic rubber program fundamentally reshaped global geopolitics, ironically fulfilling Japan's goal of destroying the Asian rubber monopoly, but for the benefit of the U.S., not itself. The end of colonial rubber power. After the war, the British and Dutch returned to their Asian colonies only to find their greatest economic asset, natural rubber, was devalued. The US and Western Europe now had a reliable, cheaper domestic alternative in synthetic rubber. This shift significantly weakened the economic foundations of colonial power in Southeast Asia, hastening the drive toward independence in places like Malaya and Indonesia. The rise of petrochemicals. The massive, standardized infrastructure built for Buenos production did not simply shut down. It created the backbone of the modern American petrochemical industry. The vast plants built to produce butadiene and styrene were quickly retooled to produce plastics, synthetic fibers, like nylon, and other polymers. The wartime necessity jump-started America's dominance in the chemical industry for the next 50 years. A forgotten history, a modern echo. The story of the Rubber War is an astonishing example of how a singular strategic material can trigger a cascade of scientific, industrial, and social events. The scientists were heroes, the chemical engineers were miracle workers, but the seringueros were sacrificial. For decades, the story of the rubber soldiers remained largely untold, a dark footnote in the celebrated history of the American industrial war effort. It serves as a potent reminder that even the most innovative and essential scientific victories of the modern world often carry an obscured, catastrophic human and environmental cost, particularly in the forgotten corners of the developing world. The debt owed to the people and the forest of the Amazon remains one of the largest, unacknowledged liabilities of World War II. Chapter 5: The Divorce of the Titans, Patent Wars and the Selling of the Synthetic Empire, the Peace Dividend and the Industrial Question. By late 1945, the war was won, and the immediate crisis was over. The United States possessed a powerful, reliable, and strategically secure source of rubber in the form of the massive, interconnected network of 51 synthetic rubber plants, built entirely with federal tax dollars and administered by the Rubber Reserve Company, RRC. Now, President Harry S. Truman's administration faced an immense political and economic dilemma. What do we do with a government-owned multi-billion-dollar industry that controls a vital national resource? The decision was fraught with ethical, economic, and political risks. Monopoly risk. If the government continued to operate the plants, it would effectively be a nationalized industry in direct competition with private enterprise, a political non-starter in the post-war U.S. Strategic risk. If the plants were sold off too quickly or to a single entity, the U.S. could lose its strategic independence and revert to relying on foreign, private sources, or risk a private monopoly controlling rubber. Patent risk. The entire industry was built on a government-forced sharing of patents. Once the war emergency ended, the corporations, Standard Oil, DuPont, Goodyear, etc., wanted their proprietary knowledge back, threatening to dismantle the standardized system. The intellectual property battle. Who owns the recipe? The most immediate and critical battle was over intellectual property. During the war, the RRC had compelled companies to share their patented processes for butadiene and styrene production. As the war ended, the participating companies filed legal action, arguing that the government's seizure of their patents under emergency powers must now be rescinded. The government's counter-strategy. Recognizing that returning the patents would instantly collapse the standardized, efficient system, the RRC, under the Federal Works Agency, FWA, enacted a bold compromise. Compulsory licensing. The government declared that the wartime shared technology was now subject to compulsory, non-exclusive licensing for all companies seeking to purchase and operate the plants. This meant that the core synthetic rubber recipe, the WWII process, could not be held by a single company. The public trust. The government argued that the wartime advancements, largely funded by public money and often achieved through collaborative effort at the government's insistence, constituted a national asset that should remain in the public trust, available to anyone who wanted to buy a plant. This aggressive legal stance was crucial. It ensured that the newly built industry would be competitive, preventing the return of the pre-war patent cartels and opening the door for new, smaller petrochemical firms to enter the market. The Great Auction, selling the industrial fortress. The official process for the massive sale began in 1948 and culminated in the Rubber Producing Facilities Disposal Act of 1953. This act laid out the terms for the largest single sell-off of government-built industrial assets in U.S. peacetime history. The assets being sold included 15 butadiene plants, complex chemical facilities generating the primary feedstock, 10 styrene plants, facilities producing the secondary component, 27 polymerization plants, the massive factories that manufactured the final WWII rubber crumb. The sale parameters. The government ensured a competitive, regulated sale. Diversification. No single company could buy a controlling number of the plants. The goal was to maintain a competitive market among giants like Goodyear, Firestone, and Gulf Oil, and smaller players. Standby capacity. The government reserved the right to lease back certain plants or keep some in a standby status for a fixed period. This was the ultimate safeguard, ensuring the U.S. military could restart production instantly if another global crisis cut off supply. Strict pricing. The sales were overseen to ensure the government recouped a fair, though not extravagant, amount of the taxpayer investment. The sale was a resounding success, injecting billions of dollars and sophisticated chemical infrastructure directly into the private sector. It formally dissolved the RRC, marking the transition of the U.S. from a state-run wartime industrial economy back to a private, market-driven one. The birth of modern petrochemicals. The sale had immense and lasting effects beyond the rubber industry. Integration and innovation. Companies that bought the butadiene and styrene plants, like Dow Chemical and Standard Oil, now had a reliable, high-volume source of feedstock for other polymers. They quickly re-engineered these facilities to produce materials for plastics, synthetic fibers, and countless consumer goods. The wartime investment in rubber infrastructure became the foundation for the entire post-war petrochemical boom that defined American material culture in the latter half of the 20th century. Final defeat of natural rubber. The competitive price and high quality of the now privatized synthetic rubber ensured that natural rubber would never again dominate the market. While essential for specific, high-performance applications, like aircraft tires, synthetic rubber became the global standard for automotive and industrial needs. This permanently shifted immense wealth away from the tropical nations of Southeast Asia and back to the industrial centers of the US and Europe. The final legacy. The cost of security. The war for rubber stands as a complete historical narrative. A national crisis was solved through an unparalleled partnership of science, industry, and government intervention. The astonishing achievements, the blight-resistant hybrids, the $1 billion synthetic plants, the defeat of the blight, came at a hidden price. The abandonment of the rubber soldiers and the disruption of the Amazon, the forced pooling and subsequent privatization of intellectual property, and the final, absolute destruction of the global natural rubber monopoly. The legacy is one of successful self-reliance, secured through the largest single material mobilization in U.S. history, forever changing the global economic map and cementing the modern American dependence on petrochemicals. Chapter 6. The Return of the Tree, the Unfinished War in the Modern Age. The post-war illusion of chemical supremacy. For 4 decades after World War II, synthetic rubber was king. American industry, fueled by cheap petroleum, prioritized the chemical solution. Natural rubber became a niche material, primarily used for large truck tires, aircraft tires, and surgical gloves, applications where its superior tensile strength and heat dissipation could not be matched by the synthetic alternatives. This period was marked by a dangerous overconfidence. Scientists believed they could chemically engineer a substitute for every biological material. The blight-resistant Hevea hybrids, though successful, were mostly planted in Africa and Southeast Asia by post-colonial nations seeking economic diversification, not in the US, which felt protected by its chemical fortress. The oil crises and the environmental reckoning. The first major cracks in this chemical fortress appeared during the oil crises of the 1970s. As the cost of crude oil, the primary feedstock for butadiene and styrene, skyrocketed, the cost of synthetic rubber followed suit. Suddenly, the low-cost, naturally produced latex from the resilient Asian and African plantations became economically competitive again. This crisis was compounded by a growing environmental consciousness in the U.S. Petrochemical pollution, the production of synthetic rubber and its feedstocks, butadiene and styrene, is energy-intensive and creates hazardous waste streams, contributing to air and water pollution in the industrial heartland. Climate concerns. As climate science advanced, the long-term sustainability of relying on fossil fuels for essential materials was questioned. The U.S. realized that its strategic independence, bought with immense wartime effort, was tied directly to the unstable price of oil. The resilience of the Hevea tree, which runs on solar energy and water, suddenly seemed like the ultimate form of strategic security. The blight's modern shadow, a biological time bomb. The most profound realization, and the one that directly connects back to Dr. E.V. Fawcett's quiet efforts in the 1940s, is the persistent, evolving threat of the South American leaf blight, Microcyclus ule. Today, nearly 95% of the world's natural rubber is still grown in a tight geographic band across Southeast Asia. Despite decades of advanced monitoring, the threat of the blight spreading from South America to Asia remains a catastrophic biological time bomb. A single, adaptive mutation of the blight that manages to cross the Pacific, carried by wind or air travel, could instantly wipe out the world's entire natural rubber supply. Experts estimate such a biological collapse would cost the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars and cripple essential supply chains overnight. The U.S., recognizing this existential threat, has returned to the botanical drawing board. The new American rubber quest, WWII and genetic engineering. The fear of a global blight pandemic has sparked a second, modernized U.S. rubber quest, focused on two main areas. 1. The desert solution, WWII. The U.S. government and private companies are heavily investing in WWII, Parthenium argentatum. This shrub, native to the deserts of the American Southwest, produces high-quality, hypoallergenic latex that is chemically identical to Hevea rubber, but is entirely immune to the Amazonian blight because it is a different species. WWII can be farmed on U.S. soil, providing true, domestic independence for the first time. The challenge is optimizing the desert crop for high yield and commercial viability, a botanical and agricultural hurdle that echoes the Fordlandia efforts, but armed with modern science. 2. Genetic fortification and hypersensitivity. The research labs, many of which trace their lineage back to the USDA operations of the 1940s, are now using genetic engineering to fortify the Hevea tree itself. Scientists are mapping the blight resistance genes collected during the wartime smuggling operations and looking for ways to insert or activate them more robustly. Simultaneously, global monitoring systems are in place. A biological hypersensitivity. Any new plant disease outbreak in South America is treated as a major international incident, triggering immediate, coordinated response protocols to prevent its spread. Conclusion: the unfinished war. The astonishing, secret history of America's war for rubber, fought in jungle camps, dusty airfields, and sterile chemical labs, did more than just win World War II. It created a powerful, paradoxical legacy. It birthed the colossal U.S. petrochemical industry but simultaneously cemented a global over-reliance on a single, vulnerable biological product. It proved America's ability to achieve industrial miracles but obscured the tragic human cost of that miracle in the Amazon. Today, the war is unfinished. It has shifted from a military necessity to a battle for economic and ecological resilience. The fight continues in the quiet greenhouses where scientists are perfecting the WWII shrub, and in the satellite monitoring rooms where analysts watch for the first signs of the South American leaf blight. The shadow of the 1942 crisis, the fear of a world without rubber, still looms large, driving a new generation of American scientists to finally achieve the strategic security that eluded the nation 80 years ago. Chapter 7. The Bitter Cure, America's Second Secret War for Quinine. The Silent Killer, a crisis beyond rubber. While the American war machine struggled for traction without rubber, its soldiers were dying from an enemy far older and more insidious than the Japanese Imperial Army: malaria. The vast majority of the Pacific War was fought in tropical and subtropical zones where the Anopheles mosquito reigned supreme. The jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines were saturated with malaria parasites. For every soldier wounded by a Japanese bullet, dozens were debilitated by the paralyzing chills, fever, and delirium of malaria. In the early stages of the war, the statistics were horrifying. On Guadalcanal, for instance, there were roughly 10 times more cases of malaria than combat casualties. General Douglas MacArthur famously quipped that the Pacific was a war against three enemies: the Japanese, the climate, and the mosquito. Just as with rubber, the only reliable defense, the essential drug, was almost entirely controlled by America's enemy. The drug was quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree. The Dutch monopoly, a century of control. The cinchona tree, like hevea, rubber, was originally native to the Andes Mountains of South America. But in the mid-19th century, the Dutch government successfully transplanted the species to their colonies in Southeast Asia, primarily Java, Dutch East Indies. By 1941, the Dutch had meticulously cultivated their Javanese plantations to supply over 95% of the world's quinine. The US and the Allies were utterly dependent on the Dutch supply line. The moment the Japanese invaded and swiftly captured Java in early 1942, they seized control of the entire global quinine stockpile and the living cinchona plantations. The U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps faced the prospect of fighting a vast, tropical war without the one drug that could keep their forces alive and operational. The strategic loss of quinine was arguably a more immediate and dangerous threat to manpower than the loss of rubber. Operation Cinchona, the quest for the mother tree. President Roosevelt immediately commissioned a top-secret counter-operation, often referred to as Operation Cinchona. The mission was simple and desperate: return to the Andes, the original home of the cinchona tree, and re-establish a supply chain. The U.S. government, primarily through the Foreign Economic Administration, FEA, and the Board of Economic Warfare, BEW, dispatched a small army of botanists, ethnobotanists, and former jungle explorers into the high, rugged cloud forests of Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. The challenge was immense. The wrong trees, the best, most potent cinchona trees, Cinchona legeriana, that the Dutch had cultivated were no longer common in the wild Andes. The trees that remained were often lower quality, lower yield varieties. The race, U.S. teams were not alone. The German government, keenly aware of the Allied weakness, also had agents in the region attempting to purchase or smuggle cinchona bark to aid their U-boat crews and North African forces. The terrain, the wild cinchona grew at specific high altitudes, accessible only by foot, mule, or dangerous, single-engine plane flights. The bitter harvest, the peril of the cascarilleros. The U.S. operation quickly devolved into a frantic, chaotic race to strip the high forests of any remaining bark. The FEA funded teams of local laborers, known historically as cascarilleros, bark collectors, who were sent into the mountains with U.S. funding and logistical support. The process was brutal and unsustainable. Debt and exploitation. Much like the rubber tappers in the Amazon, the cascarilleros were often exploited by local patrones who received bulk payments from the U.S. government but paid the laborers meager wages, trapping them in poverty. Ecological destruction. The quickest way to harvest the bark was to fell the entire tree. The U.S. demand for speed and volume led to massive, indiscriminate deforestation of cinchona stands across the high Andes. The long-term health of the wild cinchona population was severely compromised to meet the immediate, existential needs of the U.S. military. Quality control. Due to the rush, much of the bark collected was poor quality. U.S. processing labs back home struggled to extract sufficient amounts of pure quinine alkaloid from the heterogeneous batches. The scientific breakthrough. The rise of atabrine. Despite the heroic and destructive efforts in the Andes, Operation Cinchona could only provide a trickle of the necessary drug. Just as synthetic rubber saved the day for logistics, a chemical alternative saved the day for medicine: atabrine, mepicrine. Atabrine was a synthetic anti-malarial drug, developed primarily in Germany during the 1930s. The U.S. Medical Corps faced immense institutional resistance to switching from the proven, natural quinine to the new, synthetic atabrine. Side effects. Atabrine had known side effects, including skin discoloration, turning soldiers' skin yellow, and gastrointestinal distress, leading to widespread reluctance among the troops. Propaganda. The Japanese, aware of the psychological effect, spread propaganda that atabrine caused impotence and insanity, further fueling resistance. The U.S. military was forced to issue mandatory orders for its consumption and launched massive public health campaigns to combat the stigma. The motto became, "Take your atabrine and save your life." Atabrine, while not perfect, was effective. By 1944, U.S. factories were mass-producing millions of tablets, ensuring that every soldier in the Pacific was receiving prophylactic treatment. This synthetic solution dramatically reduced incapacitation rates, fundamentally turning the tide against the silent killer. The legacy, a bitter lesson in dependence. The story of the quinine crisis is a mirror image of the rubber crisis, demonstrating a critical flaw in 1940s U.S. strategy: an over-reliance on single, foreign-controlled biological sources for essential materials. The long-term legacy is complex. Scientific independence. The necessity of developing atabrine accelerated U.S. research into synthetic anti-malarial drugs, which eventually led to better, more targeted drugs like chloroquine and, later, artemisinin derivatives. The forgotten tree. The frenzied deforestation and neglect of the Andes cinchona trees during the war caused irreparable harm to the ecosystem. Today, conservationists struggle to preserve the remaining wild cinchona, a victim of both historical exploitation and the rise of synthetic chemistry. The war was ultimately won not just by brave soldiers, but by the chemists who perfected atabrine and the desperate botanists who fought a second, secret war for the bitter bark of the cinchona tree. Chapter 8. The Weatherman's Burden. Forecasting Destiny for Operation Overlord. The Tyranny of the Troposphere. In the early months of 1944, the entire focus of the Allied command, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, was entirely dependent on one unpredictable factor: the weather. The invasion of Normandy required a precise, narrow window of atmospheric conditions. Low wind, to allow the landing craft to approach the beaches without capsizing and to keep the paratroopers from being blown miles off target. Low tide, daylight essential for troops to spot and navigate the German underwater obstacles that had been laid on the beaches. This restricted the invasion to only a few days each month. Minimal cloud cover, needed for the massive aerial bombing campaign to effectively target German defenses and for fighter support. Between the necessary tides and the ideal weather conditions, the available dates were few: June 5th, 6th, or 7th, 1944. If the Allies missed this window, they would have to wait 2 more weeks for the next suitable tide, giving the Germans crucial time to strengthen their defenses. The man who held the fate of the invasion in his hands was Group Captain James Stagg, a dour, brilliant Scottish meteorologist placed in charge of the Allied Expeditionary Forces meteorological team. The three factions, a battle of forecasts. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, famously distrusted meteorologists. To ensure he received the most comprehensive and unbiased predictions, he established a system where three rival meteorological teams, each with distinct methods and data sources, reported to him independently. The British Admiralty team, the traditionalists, focused on naval conditions and relied heavily on long-established patterns of pressure systems moving across the Atlantic. The British Air Ministry team, the theorists led by scientists, they relied on more cutting-edge mathematical modeling and upper-air analysis. The American team, the innovators led by the U.S. Army Air Forces, they brought in the newest U.S. technologies, including advanced atmospheric sounding balloons and early computing aids. Stagg's impossible task was to synthesize these often conflicting forecasts, a process Eisenhower likened to listening to three doctors tell him three different things about the same patient. The intelligence black hole, missing the data. The greatest hurdle facing the Allied meteorologists was a catastrophic lack of data from the one place that mattered most, the North Atlantic. Weather systems in the Northern Hemisphere primarily move from west to east. To accurately predict the weather over the English Channel, the teams needed real-time atmospheric readings from the vast, open ocean, particularly off the coast of Greenland and Iceland. However, the German U-boat presence had eliminated almost all Allied shipping in that area, creating an intelligence black hole in the weather data. The Germans, conversely, had an advantage. They controlled the Western European coast and had established clandestine, automated weather stations in remote Allied territories. The German Weather Station Plot. Astonishingly, U.S. and British forces had to launch small, high-risk military operations to find and dismantle German weather stations established in places like Greenland. German naval teams would land secretly to set up automated stations that radioed data back to German high command, giving them superior warning of Atlantic fronts. The Arctic and Spitsbergen, these remote sites were critical. The Allies launched commando raids and air patrols to hunt down these sophisticated, autonomous stations, recognizing that the German ability to predict the Channel weather was a direct threat to overlord secrecy. The final decision, June 4th and the Storm of Destiny. The initial date chosen for the invasion was June 5th, 1944. On June 3rd, the weather teams delivered their verdict. All three groups, for once, were in agreement. Disaster was imminent. A massive, deep depression was sweeping across the Atlantic, promising high winds, low clouds, and gale force waves for June 5th. Stagg had to walk into Eisenhower's headquarters at Southwick House and tell the Supreme Commander, with the weight of millions of lives on his conscience, to stand down the invasion. Eisenhower, who had already ordered the initial waves of ships to begin moving, faced the most agonizing decision of the war. He ordered a 24-hour delay, gambling that the storm might pass. On the evening of June 4th, the teams met again. The storm was raging, but Stagg, analyzing new, last-minute data from a reconnaissance flight over the Atlantic, delivered a revolutionary prediction. The reprieve, the deep storm, would pass quickly. A brief, 36-hour window of relative calm, low winds, moderate seas, and high cloud, enough for cover but low enough for air support, would open on the morning of June 6th. The certainty, this window would be followed immediately by the worst Atlantic storm in decades, making any landing impossible for days. Stagg told Eisenhower, "The 6th is the only feasible day for the operation. If we do not go tomorrow, we face a major delay." The green light and the German miscalculation. Eisenhower famously gave the terse, final order, "Okay, we'll go." The German High Command, relying on its own meteorological data which indicated the massive storm, made the fatal miscalculation. Convinced that no sane Allied commander would attempt a landing in such unstable conditions, many high-ranking officers, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, left their posts to attend a birthday celebration or visit family. When the massive Allied fleet crossed the Channel in the brief window of calm predicted by Stagg, they achieved complete strategic surprise. The German defenses were undermanned, and the initial response was sluggish. The success of D-Day, the greatest military amphibious invasion in history, literally hinged on the scientific analysis of a few men and their ability to read the unpredictable shifts in the Atlantic air masses. It was a victory of prediction, as much as it was a victory of arms. Chapter 9: The Desert Arteries, Securing the Oil That Won the War. The Engine of Conflict, Fuel as Fate. By 1943, the outcome of World War II was less about infantry and more about logistics, and logistics ran entirely on fuel. The U.S. military machine, with its vast fleets of ships, planes, and tanks, consumed oil at a rate previously unimaginable. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, understood this calculus perfectly. Germany's relentless drive toward the Soviet oil fields of the Caucasus and Japan's swift capture of the Indonesian oil refineries were not mere territorial conquests. They were strategic moves aimed at paralyzing the Allies. While American oil production was immense, the sheer scale of the global conflict, supplying the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the European theaters simultaneously, meant that Allied victory depended on securing stable, protected access to the growing reserves in the Middle East, primarily Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. The Arabian Shield, establishing the U.S. presence. Prior to the war, British and French interests largely dominated the Middle Eastern oil landscape. The U.S., though, had a critical stake through companies like the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, which was aggressively developing Saudi Arabian fields. The U.S. government, led by the Petroleum Administration for War, PAW, realized that the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia was a strategic asset that needed explicit military and diplomatic protection. The operation had two main facets. Diplomatic securitization. The U.S. sought to solidify its alliance with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, ensuring he would resist Axis influence. The most pivotal moment occurred in February 1945, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt met personally with King Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. This meeting, though brief, laid the foundation for the decades-long U.S.-Saudi security alliance. U.S. military protection in exchange for reliable oil access. Infrastructure development. The U.S. military established a presence in the region, initially focused on building infrastructure to support the supply line. The construction of the Dhahran airfield in Saudi Arabia, funded and built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, was ostensibly for air transport but served as a crucial strategic foothold, cementing the U.S. military's access to the Arabian Peninsula. The Persian Corridor, the supply line to the Soviet Union. One of the most astonishing and often overlooked logistical achievements of World War II was the Persian Corridor. This was not about securing oil for the U.S., but about supplying the struggling Soviet Union, which was reeling from the loss of its Western industries and was critical to keeping the German Wehrmacht tied down on the Eastern Front. The U.S. and Britain poured enormous resources into transforming the antiquated infrastructure of Iran, then known as Persia, into a massive, high-capacity supply route. Port development. Allied engineers dramatically expanded the ports of Bandar Shapur and Khorramshahr in the Persian Gulf to handle unprecedented volumes of cargo. Rail and road construction. The single-track Trans-Iranian Railway was modernized, new sections were built, and thousands of trucks, assembled in Iran, were deployed to create a parallel road network. Logistics management. Thousands of U.S. Army personnel were stationed in Iran, managing the flow of trains, trucks, and aircraft carrying everything from tanks and jeeps to food and aircraft parts destined for the Soviet front. The Persian Corridor was a critical artery that funneled over 5 million tons of vital war material to the USSR. It was the physical manifestation of the strategic realization that the war could not be won without supporting the Soviet Union, and its existence depended entirely on securing the Middle Eastern transport route. The threat of sabotage. Operation Cone. The Axis powers recognized the critical nature of the Middle East oil and supply lines. The German Abwehr, military intelligence, launched numerous secret efforts aimed at disrupting the flow. One of the most significant threats was the potential for sabotage against the oil fields, ports, and pipelines. The U.S. launched a counterintelligence effort known internally as Operation Cone, Cooperation on Near East, which involved deploying covert intelligence officers and engineers to monitor key installations. The primary objective was to counter Axis agents, identify and neutralize German and Italian agents attempting to recruit local dissidents to carry out bombings or structural damage. Physical security. Harden the ports, bridges, and rail junctions against attack. The massive oil refineries and shipping terminals in Abadan and Haifa were placed under continuous Allied military guard. The success of Operation Cone was absolute. Despite numerous attempts and plots, no major, sustained disruption of the Middle Eastern oil fields or the Persian corridor occurred during the war, ensuring the continuous flow of fuel and supplies that sustained the war effort on 3 continents. A new strategic focus. The post-war pivot. The immediate necessities of World War II, securing a reliable fuel supply and creating a logistics corridor to the Soviet Union, had an unforeseen, lasting consequence. They permanently shifted the center of gravity of U.S. geopolitical strategy. The establishment of the U.S.-Saudi Security Pact ensured American access to the world's largest oil reserves, making the Persian Gulf a central focus of U.S. foreign policy for the next 8 decades. The infrastructure investments in the Persian corridor demonstrated the massive logistical capability required to project power across the Middle East and Central Asia. The silent, successful war for oil, logistics, and influence in the desert sands was arguably the most significant geopolitical legacy of the U.S. involvement in World War II, setting the stage for the Cold War and the modern Middle Eastern security architecture. Chapter 10. The Ultimate Prize. Uranium, V-weapons, and the hunt for the atom. The race with an invisible finish line. By 1944, the Allied High Command was acutely aware that the war's ultimate victory might not be determined by tanks or troops, but by the splitting of the atom. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill knew that while the U.S. was pouring billions into the secret Manhattan Project, Nazi Germany possessed the fundamental science, the skilled physicists, and the initial motivation to build an atomic weapon first. The race for the atomic bomb was thus a race for 3 things: scientists, materials, and intelligence. The secret Allied operation to neutralize German nuclear efforts and secure the necessary resources was codenamed Operation Alsos, Greek for Grove, a clever reference to the project's lead, General Leslie Groves. Alsos was a unique, combined intelligence and scientific unit that followed the advancing Allied armies into Europe. The material hunt. Securing the uranium. The most immediate concern was securing the uranium stockpile. While the U.S. relied heavily on deposits from the Belgian Congo, the Germans had seized crucial stocks in Europe. Belgian-Congo connection. The U.S. government, understanding the future necessity of this material, had secretly bought and smuggled out tons of high-grade uranium ore from the Belgian Congo before the Germans could seize it. This preemptive material acquisition was a key, unheralded factor in the Manhattan Project's head start. The stolen cash, as Allied forces pushed into France and Belgium, Alsos teams, often preceding combat troops, raced to locate any stockpiles of uranium that the Nazis might have hidden or transported. The most significant success occurred near the Belgian town of Olen, where Alsos discovered over 1,000 tons of refined uranium ore, hidden from both the Germans and the advancing Allies. This critical cash was immediately shipped to the U.S. under heavy guard. This relentless pursuit of raw material was driven by the fear that even a small amount of uranium could accelerate a German nuclear program or, worse, fall into Soviet hands. The scientific hunt. Operation Paperclip, and the German scientists. The Alsos mission's ultimate prize was not the material, but the men who understood the science, the German atomic physicists. The U.S. launched Operation Paperclip, a clandestine program managed by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, which aimed to extract German scientists and engineers who had specialized knowledge of advanced weapons technology. Werner Heisenberg, the most important target, was Nobel laureate and head of the German nuclear research program, Werner Heisenberg. Alsos teams tracked him to the small German town of Hechingen and detained him. The aim was not just capture, but understanding how far the German program had advanced. The shocking truth revealed by their captured documents and scientists was that the German program was far less organized and less advanced than the Allies had feared, largely due to internal politics and miscalculations by Heisenberg himself. The V-weapon specialists. While the atomic program was the primary focus, the most immediately useful German scientists were those involved in the V-weapon, V-2 rocket program. The US, the Soviets, and the British raced to secure the key personnel from the V-2 facility at Peenemünde. The U.S. success in this hunt, securing engineers like Wernher von Braun and his entire team, was a crucial strategic victory, laying the immediate foundation for the American missile and space programs that would define the Cold War. The Battle of the Underground Reactor. The climax of the Alsos operation occurred in the final days of the war. Allied intelligence pinpointed the location of the German experimental nuclear reactor, hidden deep within a cave beneath a castle in the village of Hagerloch. The Alsos teams, led by Colonel Boris Pasch, raced against both the disintegrating German forces and the rapidly advancing French army, whose command the U.S. did not trust with the secrets of atomic research. The capture. Alsos reached the bunker first. They found the heavy water, the graphite blocks, and the small, experimental reactor vessel, the core of the German atom project. The dismantling. In a desperate, high-pressure operation, the Alsos engineers worked quickly to dismantle the entire facility, destroying what they could not take, and shipping the crucial heavy water and remaining uranium cubes back to the United States. This physical dismantling of the German research effectively ended any threat of a post-war German nuclear capability and denied the crucial evidence to the Soviet Union. The bitter conclusion and the dawn of a new era. The success of Operation Alsos, the seizure of uranium, and the recruitment of the V2 scientists were essential components of the ultimate U.S. victory. The intelligence gathered confirmed that the Manhattan Project, though built on fear of German competition, was decisively ahead. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, it was the culmination of not just the work in the New Mexico desert, but of the tireless, hidden efforts of the Alsos teams who fought a secret war for control of material and knowledge across the ruins of Europe. The successful capture of the German rocket scientists, however, introduced a profound moral dilemma. Integrating individuals who had worked for the Nazi regime into the highest levels of American military and scientific research. This dark exchange, security and technological supremacy bought with a compromise of moral principles, would haunt the American consciousness for decades, marking the true beginning of the Cold War era. Chapter 11. The Breach at Los Alamos, the Atom Spies and the Loss of the Monopoly. The Illusion of Inviolability. In the summer of 1945, the United States possessed the atomic bomb, the ultimate weapon, and believed it had a near-perfect nuclear monopoly. The Manhattan Project, costing over $2 billion, tens of billions in modern dollars, and employing hundreds of thousands of people, was regarded as the most secure secret in human history. The scientists and engineers were isolated at sites like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, living under a veil of total secrecy. Yet, this carefully constructed shield was deeply compromised. The Soviet Union, excluded from the Manhattan Project despite its critical role in fighting the Axis, had successfully infiltrated the project at multiple crucial levels: scientific, technical, and industrial. This espionage was driven not by monetary gain, but by ideological conviction. a belief that America's control over such a powerful weapon was a threat to global peace and that the knowledge belonged to the world, or at least to their communist ally. Klaus Fuchs, the ultimate scientific betrayal. The most damaging atomic spy was Dr. Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant German theoretical physicist and committed communist who had fled Nazi persecution and was working directly on the most sensitive aspects of bomb design at Los Alamos. Fuchs had intimate, daily access to the core secrets, including implosion design, the complex method required to compress the plutonium core of the Fat Man bomb, a secret that was technically far more difficult than the uranium-based Little Boy design. Critical mass calculations, the exact amount of fissile material needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Hydrodynamics and detonation timing, the precise engineering required to ensure the implosion was symmetrical and achieved proper ignition. Fuchs met regularly with his Soviet handlers, passing over highly detailed, hand-drawn blueprints and equations. His intelligence was so precise and complete that it gave the Soviet Union a roadmap that shaved years off their own development timeline. The technical network, Rosenberg and Greenglass. The espionage network extended beyond high-level science into engineering and production, demonstrating the breadth of the Soviet effort. David Greenglass, a machinist at the Los Alamos facility, he passed technical drawings of components, particularly the crucial lens mold for the implosion device, to his Soviet contact. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Greenglass's brother-in-law and sister, they served as the conduits for transferring the physical secrets, drawings, written notes, and technical specifications from Greenglass and others to the Soviet intelligence handlers in New York City. The Rosenbergs' capture, trial, and execution became one of the most polarizing and controversial episodes of the early Cold War. These agents provided the detailed how-to manual, allowing the Soviets to bypass thousands of man-hours of trial-and-error engineering. The shock of 1949. Monopoly shattered. The consequence of this espionage was revealed on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic device, First Lightning, Jo-1. The speed of the Soviet success sent shockwaves through the U.S. government. American intelligence analysts had predicted the Soviet Union would not achieve nuclear capability until the mid-1950s. The premature detonation forced a painful realization: America's absolute security was an illusion. The Soviets had caught up far faster than physically possible through independent research alone. The subsequent investigations, led by the FBI and the newly formed CIA, slowly uncovered the espionage rings. Fuchs was finally exposed and confessed in 1950, leading to the identification of Greenglass and the Rosenbergs. The dawn of the hydrogen bomb race. The loss of the nuclear monopoly had two devastating consequences for the U.S. Immediate arms race. President Truman, advised by a frantic military and scientific community, immediately ordered a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb, H-bomb, a weapon theoretically 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. This decision escalated the arms race exponentially, ushering in the era of mutually assured destruction, MAD. Paranoia and McCarthyism. The shocking revelation that ideological traitors had operated within the most sensitive military project fueled an intense wave of domestic anti-communist paranoia, driving the McCarthy era witch hunts and irrevocably altering the relationship between the American government, its scientists, and its citizens. The fear of the enemy within became the dominant psychological force of the early Cold War. The espionage at Los Alamos was not merely a security breach, it was the mechanism that defined the next 4 decades of global history, directly trading America's temporary strategic security for an era of persistent nuclear fear. Chapter 12. The Superbomb Debate. Moral Science versus Total Security. The Decision Point. The Soviet Shock. The successful Soviet atomic test in August 1949, fueled by the secrets leaked from Los Alamos, shattered the sense of U.S. security. President Harry S. Truman faced immense pressure from military and political leaders to regain the technological advantage. The solution presented by the most hawkish scientists was the superbomb, a thermonuclear weapon based on the fusion of hydrogen isotopes. The primary scientific champion of the H-bomb was Dr. Edward Teller, a Hungarian-American physicist often called the father of the H-bomb. He had advocated for the weapon since the Manhattan Project and now found his moment. The scientific schism, Oppenheimer versus Teller. The proposal to build the H-bomb immediately triggered a profound moral and scientific debate, the likes of which America had never seen. The key battle was fought within the General Advisory Committee, GAC, of the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, led by Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer. The Oppenheimer camp, Moral Caution Oppenheimer, and the GAC majority argued passionately against building the H-bomb. Their primary objections were moral and strategic. Genocide, the weapon's yield was limitless and its use constituted a weapon of genocide, crossing a moral threshold far beyond the atomic bomb. No military target. Its destructive power was so vast that it had no conceivable military target and could only be used against massive civilian populations. Arms race. Building it would inevitably provoke the Soviets to do the same, leading to a permanent existential arms race with no end. The Teller/strategic camp, technological imperative Teller, mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, and powerful figures like AEC Chairman Lewis Strauss argued that the weapon was a necessary technological imperative. Security. If the US did not develop it, the Soviets certainly would, leaving the US defenseless against an enemy with supreme power. Deterrence. Only a weapon of absolute power could deter the absolute threat of global communism. The breakthrough. Teller and Ulam had perfected the Teller-Ulam configuration, the elegant scientific design that finally made the H-bomb feasible. The presidential command. The debate raged for months, pitting scientific idealists against Cold War strategists. Ultimately, the political and security arguments prevailed. On January 31, 1950, President Truman issued a secret, direct order. The United States would proceed with the development of the superbomb. Truman's rationale was simple. I feel that I must not shirk this responsibility. I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or superbomb. This decision cemented the technological direction of the Cold War and signaled the permanent triumph of scientific capability over ethical reservation in the face of existential threat. Operation Ivy and the Test of a Sun. With the political mandate secured, the project proceeded at a breakneck pace. The superbomb was not built in a conventional sense. It was an industrial-sized experiment. The test device, code-named Mike, was housed in a massive cylindrical apparatus weighing 82 tons. It was placed on the remote Enuitak Atoll in the Pacific. On November 1, 1952, the test occurred as part of Operation Ivy. The yield, Mike's blast yielded 10.4 megatons, nearly 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The explosion instantly vaporized the entire island of Elyichlab, leaving behind a mile-wide crater. The aftermath. The fallout from the test reached the stratosphere, demonstrating the weapon's global threat. The immediate Soviet response confirmed Oppenheimer's fears. The USSR rapidly accelerated its own fusion program and successfully tested its first thermonuclear device, a less practical design, less than a year later. The fallout. McCarthyism and the destruction of Oppenheimer. The triumph of the H-bomb had a dark sequel. The bitter conflict between Teller and Oppenheimer over the H-bomb was weaponized by AEC Chairman Lewis Strauss and others who saw Oppenheimer as a dangerous voice of dissent and a symbol of intellectual resistance to the Cold War state. In 1954, Oppenheimer was subjected to a highly publicized and politically motivated security hearing. Key aspects of the inquiry focused on his pre-war associations and his opposition to the H-bomb. Though the charges of disloyalty were never proven, the AEC stripped Oppenheimer of his security clearance. This move was widely seen as a chilling message. In the new nuclear age, scientific advice was welcome, but moral dissent would be punished. The removal of the father of the atomic bomb by the very government he served marked the high point of the government's willingness to purge any perceived ideological weakness in its pursuit of absolute security. The H-bomb decision and its aftermath redefined the American scientific landscape, ensuring that the development of technology would forever be entangled with, and often subservient to, the demands of national security and the Cold War arms race. The colonial hangover, resource wars, and the birth of the Third World. The price of strategic security. The success of the U.S. resource campaigns during World War II, securing oil from the Middle East, capturing the hevea and cinchona genetics, and building massive synthetic industries, came at the expense of the resource-rich nations of the Global South. As the Allies celebrated victory, these countries were left grappling with a complex, destructive legacy. Ecological damage. The desperate, wartime extraction methods, raping the Amazonian forests for cinchona and overtapping hevea, left behind degraded ecosystems and destabilized local environments. Economic disruption. The massive U.S. investment and subsequent abrupt withdrawal, particularly in the Amazon, destabilized regional economies, leaving tens of thousands of workers stranded and indebted. Dependency and devaluation. The rise of synthetic rubber and synthetic anti-malarials permanently devalued natural commodities. Nations that depended on these primary products for their post-colonial economic independence found their main export earners drastically undercut by American chemical innovation. The new imperialism, resource control. In the post-war era, the strategic control of natural resources became the new form of imperial influence, replacing direct colonial rule. Oil dominance. The U.S.-Saudi Security Pact, cemented during the war, ensured Western access to the vast Persian Gulf reserves. This guaranteed low-cost fuel for American industry but provided the U.S. with immense political leverage over the ruling monarchies and, later, the post-colonial governments of the region. This set the stage for decades of Western intervention and geopolitical maneuvering in the Middle East. The Banana Republic model. The wartime push for tropical self-sufficiency led to significant U.S. investment in Central and South America to grow food and industrial crops. These investments often entrenched the power of U.S. corporations, like United Fruit, creating the archetype of the Banana Republic, countries whose political stability and economic output were disproportionately controlled by foreign commercial interests seeking reliable access to cheap resources. The Bandung spirit, resistance to the nuclear club. The growing economic exploitation and the terrifying new reality of the nuclear arms race, controlled entirely by the U.S. and the USSR, galvanized resistance in the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa. The pivotal moment came in 1955 with the Asian-African Conference in Bandung, Indonesia. Leaders from 29 newly independent nations, including figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, India, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt, and Sukarno, Indonesia, met to forge a common political voice. The key tenets of the Bandung spirit were self-determination, support for the complete decolonization of all remaining territories, non-alignment, a refusal to join either the US-led NATO or the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact power blocs. The new nations rejected the demand to choose sides, asserting their right to independent foreign policy. Economic equity, a demand for fair prices for their raw materials and an end to the Western economic control that devalued their primary exports. The Bandung Conference officially marked the birth of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, and the conceptualization of the Third World, nations seeking political and economic paths independent of the two nuclear superpowers. A debt repaid, the quinine and rubber legacies. The U.S. resource wars of World War II unintentionally created two profound, contrasting legacies that later influenced U.S. foreign policy. The technical debt, the blight-resistant Hevia hybrids, perfected by the USDA in the 1940s, were eventually shared globally. These robust clones helped nations like Malaysia and Brazil diversify their own plantations, providing the foundation for modern, stable agricultural economies in the post-war era, a small, positive technical transfer resulting from the initial necessity. The medical debt, the decades-long reliance on synthetic drugs, atabrine, chloroquine, eventually led to widespread drug resistance in the malaria parasite across Africa and Asia. By the 1980s, the world needed a new, effective drug. The solution came from the natural world, artemisinin, derived from a traditional Chinese herb. The cycle of dependency completed, demonstrating that human health could never be fully divorced from biological and botanical solutions, despite technological triumphs. Conclusion: the enduring resource battle. The hidden story of America's resource wars during World War II is a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy. The astonishing ingenuity that built the synthetic empire, won the weather battle, and secured the atomic secret came with geopolitical consequences that are still unfolding. The U.S. achieved strategic security, but in doing so, it helped birth a new world order defined by the non-aligned struggle for economic independence and the relentless global tension surrounding the control of essential resources, a battle that continues to define modern international relations.